Okay, so a fish out of water. You don't fit in the place where you are. The Israelites had this problem. Last week I said that Jerusalem was conquered. They watched the city fall to the ground. And then they were taken into exile to a faraway land, to the land of Babylon. And in Babylon, they had to learn to live under a different culture, under a different way of life, a different language, and all of these things, and none of it fit into what they knew before. They were a fish out of water. They were in a foreign place. And what's significant about that is that the whole idea of the way that the people who were faithful to God worked, the whole idea of religion switched in that moment. Because prior to that, the people of God were a particular people, right? They were a particular nation. They gathered in one place. They had their headquarters in Jerusalem. And now all of a sudden, the people of God are spread out in faraway places. And the culture in which they live is not friendly to the culture in which they came from. And all of a sudden, they're living as foreigners in another land. They're living as fish out of water. And the truth is that we, as Christians, thousands of years later, are in a similar position. That is, we are not at our home. We are instead in a foreign land. We are fish out of water. People who belong in heaven but live on earth. And we have to figure out somehow within that setting to be faithful to God in a culture that isn't. And the paradigm that switched at that moment continues today. So how did Daniel and his friends, especially Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how did they go about being faithful to God in a foreign land? And what was the result of their doing so? Now, here we are in the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is one of the most amazing books in the Bible. It has great story after great story after great story. And you heard them as a kid growing up. Some of them you remember better than others. But the book of Daniel is full of all these stories of Daniel and his friends being faithful to God in a foreign land. And I can go ahead and tell you, I actually wrote out a few notes because there's so many stories it's hard to remember all of them. Chapter 1. You remember when Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they were being trained to work in the king's court and to serve the king. And as such, they had to go through a year of training and learn the language, the literature, and all this or that. And at one point, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they decided, we are not going to eat the food off of the king's table. You remember that? And so we're not going to eat the king's food. Rather, we're going to not eat this defiled food. We're just going to have just serve us vegetables and water. Today, you may have heard something called the Daniel fast, which I think is based off of that passage. And personally, I would hate to eat vegetables and water all the time, but that's what they did. And they convinced the guard to let them try it for 10 days. If they came back less healthy than the other guys, then they would eat the defiled food. But in fact, after 10 days, they looked better. And God blessed them. And they were allowed to continue with their culture and their faithfulness to God by eating the food that they felt God wanted them to eat. Chapter 1, faithful to God, and God rewarding it. Chapter 2, let's get a little further in the story. Now, you have Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has a powerful dream. And there's a statue, a giant statue in his dream. And it's got, I think, gold and bronze and iron and all these different kinds of metals. And he doesn't know what to do. And so he calls his enchanters and his dreamers and those who interpret these things. And they come up and they say, well, just tell us what you dreamed and we'll interpret it for you. He says, no, I'd like you to tell me what I dreamed. That's your job. And none of them can do it. And they say, how in the world can we do that? No one can do that. And so Nebuchadnezzar gets mad. He's going to get rid of all the magicians and the enchanters. And instead, this man by the name of Daniel shows up, says, I can do it. And he prays to God and gets the message. And he tells him his dream. And he interprets it for him. That the different parts of the statue are different empires that will come over the years and the centuries and replace the Babylonians. The Babylonians would be replaced by the Persians. The Persians would be conquered by Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. And then it would continue on with eventually the Romans. And it would go on with all these different empires. And Daniel interprets it and impresses Nebuchadnezzar and puts him in a high position. Chapter 3. This is the famous one they talked about this morning, the blazing furnace. Nebuchadnezzar sets up an image of gold, says everyone has to bow down and worship this image. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, no, that's not okay. We're not going to worship your image. And so they get in trouble. And so he gets mad and throws them inside a blazing furnace. And you remember how that goes. Nebuchadnezzar, with his assistants, peers into the fire and says, didn't we put 3 men bound up in there? Why do I see 4 walking about freely, and one of them looks like a son of God? And of course they come out unsinged. You can't smell any smoke in their hair. They're fine. Because they were faithful to God in a foreign land, and God rescued them. Fabulous story. By the way, I know that both of you use that scripture about if our God doesn't save us, we'll do it anyway. Actually, I have it on my slide. You can go. Fabulous verse. There's just this idea that our God is able to serve us, but even if He doesn't, we won't follow you. That is commitment. Commitment we didn't even see in Israel when they were actually in Jerusalem. But now they're spread out, and they're committed to it. Chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And he dreams about a tree that gets cut down. And he goes and he tries to find someone to interpret the dream. And once again he ends up with Daniel. And Daniel tells him it's bad news, Nebuchadnezzar. Because of your pride, you're going to be cut down. You're going to be driven insane. You're going to go out and wander in the fields and eat the grass like the ox. And you're going to be covered in dew. And you're going to lose your sanity. And Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really believe it. And one day he looks out at his kingdom and he says to himself and those around him, he says, look at what I have built, this great city of Babylon. Look at what I have accomplished. And immediately he's driven insane, goes out into the field and eats the grass. And eventually his period of being humbled is ended and he comes back to reality and is restored. Chapter 5. The famous hand that wrote on the wall. We have a different king by the name of Belshazzar. He's throwing a giant party with all of his kingdom officials, and they're drinking wine and having a good time. But the catch is that the goblets he's using, the ornaments, the things that are decorating the party, all come from the temple in Jerusalem, which they raided years ago. And it's rather disrespectful to use the elements of the Lord for your little party. And so this hand appears out of nowhere on the wall and writes out these words. I believe the words are many, many tekel person, which you probably don't know what that means. Neither do I. But I did read the passage. And it's a bad message. You've been tried and found wanting, and it will be taken from you. And that very night Belshazzar is slain, and his reign is ended. You saw the handwriting on the wall, right? Chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den. And this one, we have a different king now, a Persian king by the name of Darius. Who likes Daniel, and Daniel's very powerful and has influence over the whole kingdom. And all the other officials and all the others don't like Daniel because the king trusts him so much. So they go to the king, they say to the king, listen, we've got to do something. I think that you need to pass a law which can't be reversed. It says that no one can pray to any other god but you. And the king, feeling his pride, says, yeah, that sounds great. He signs it, and of course Daniel, for years, has been praying 3 times a day with the windows open to Jerusalem. And it's brought to the king's attention, and now the king signed the law. He had to follow through. So he sends Daniel to the lion's den. But the king is heartbroken. The king is literally begging that Daniel be saved. Watching him carefully. And he comes back early in the morning and says, Daniel, has your God saved you? And sure enough, Daniel was okay. He came out. And at that point, we have another evidence people being faithful to God in a faraway land. And what's really cool is, I just named 6 stories. That's only the first half of the book. The second half is all visions and really interesting visions, similar to Revelation. Revelation draws from the book of Daniel a lot. You have all these visions. I'm not even going to get into the details of those. And these are so many great stories that I could literally have picked any one of those stories and preached a sermon on it. We could have done this for 2 months. But with the way the story is formatted, we more or less have to try and cover all. So let me try to draw it all together. Let me try to pull together some concept. So we've got to figure out, what is the purpose of all this? Why are they living in a foreign land? And what is being accomplished by their faithfulness there? And more than that, we've looked at, remember the story draws this idea, this distinction between the lower story and the upper story. You've been talking about that in your small groups? The lower story is the individual actions of the characters involved and why they behave the way they do and how the story works out, the plot, the benefits, the difficulties, the resolution. But the upper story is taking a step back and looking at what God is doing. God is the main character and what He's accomplishing through them and what's happening in salvation history through this period of the story. And I want to take a moment and try and figure out why God has put them into exile and how He's going to use it. In order to think about that, I want to play a game. It's not a great game, but it's a game. The game is called Who Said This? And I've got some quotes in my slide, and I want you to read them and think about who in the world said these quotes. And we're going to bring a point out of this, I promise. But can we go to the next slide? Okay, Daniel 2. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mystery. Who said that? Nebuchadnezzar, right? Is Nebuchadnezzar a follower of God? No. He's the king of Babylon, right? The enemy of Israel. If he just said, your God is the God of gods, because Daniel had just revealed to him his dream, and he couldn't believe that Daniel could do such a thing. He couldn't believe his God would do such a thing. Let's go to the next quote. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants. They trusted in Him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Who said that? Actually, it was also Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who just says no other God can save in this way. Because he was impressed by Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego defying the king and going into the blazing furnace. Go to the next one. Find Daniel 4. At the end of that time, I raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High, honored and glorified Him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as He pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back His hand or say to Him, what have you done? And go to the next slide, because it's the same chapter. I'm just going to skip forward a little bit. Now I praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything He does is right and all His ways are just, and those who walk in pride He is able to humble. Who said that? Not a very good game, is it? They're all Nebuchadnezzar. But remember, Babylonian king here. This is not a Bible hero. This is actually a Bible villain who sees the faithfulness of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and praises the God of heaven. Go to the next one. I promise this one is different. Here's another quote. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heaven and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Darius said that. So now you have another king who's not a Christian and not a Jew, who's not an Israelite at all, who just said, he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. About the God of the Israelites, right? Now to me, is that bizarre that Daniel and his friends, their faithfulness led to kings outside of Jerusalem praising the God of heaven? Is that significant? Because I told you last week, we talked about last week, that when God separated them and sent them out of Jerusalem into the surrounding nations, all of a sudden, God's name would be told outside of the walls of Israel. And our God would be heard of in places like Babylon, and Assyria, and Persia, and other places. And all of a sudden, other people are praising the God of the Israelites because they were faithful in a place that wasn't in Israel. And his name was heard of. By the way, have you ever thought about this? I'm going to try and bring this idea because I've thought about it a few times. And it's like this. Why in the world are we today, 2,000 years later, talking about the God of a nation as small and insignificant as Israel? Because back then, the most powerful nation had the most powerful God, and he was the one you talked about. So why in the world are we not talking about the gods of Babylon? Do you even know his name? Why are we talking about the gods of Assyria? They were more powerful. They conquered. Shouldn't they be more famous? What about the gods of Egypt? Have you heard from them? What are their names? Do you know them? What about Greece, right? You've heard some of their stories. You've heard of some of their gods. But is anyone today worshiping Zeus? Why not? These nations were far more powerful, far more influential, spent less time conquered by other countries. Why are we talking about their gods? Because their gods were stories that weren't true. And their idols were made by human hands. And when they tried to spread their name of God through violence and warfare, it didn't work. But when the people of the true God were faithful to God outside of their home, the name of God became famous, and the praise of God was on the lips of foreign kings. And that's pretty interesting. And 2,000, or more than 2,000 years later, we're still talking about the God of the rather obscure nation of Israel. Because he made his name known. And he made it famous. See, I think today that the paradigm of being a follower of God has changed. Because there are those who, maybe realizing it or not, think that it's still that the most powerful God, the most powerful nation wins. That is, the U.S. has been a Christian nation from the time they were founded. And when we go out and win all of our wars, it proves that our God is right. And some people live that way. But I think that the paradigm has switched. And it's not whether or not we're a Christian nation, because there are many, many Christians here. But the truth is that Christians live in exile to some extent. We live in a foreign land. And we have pressure on every side telling us not to behave the way that we were taught and the way that we believe is right. And when we find ways to be faithful to God in a foreign land, then we have the opportunity to make God's name famous. Put the praise of God on the lips of people who don't know him yet. And to spread his message outside the nation of the U.S. or outside the walls of Thayer Christian Church or outside the walls of southeastern Kansas. We have the chance to make the name of God famous and to put the praise of God on the lips of foreign kings. Because when we decide to be faithful in a world that isn't, we leave an impact. And God follows through. And we write our own stories of amazing things that happened in the book of Daniel, where God stepped through and let the nation know that he was the one true God. And when all the other gods disappear over history, his name will still stand because he made it known. Because we were faithful in our job of being foreigners in this world. That's the paradigm of Christian faith we live under today. Followers of God, being faithful to God, being foreigners, fish out of water, where they don't belong. By the way, the New Testament, is there any evidence in the New Testament of this idea of Christians being fish out of water, having citizenship in heaven, and being foreigners on earth? Yeah, it's there. I've got a passage here in 1 Peter, and there's more. I could have drawn others. Paul talks about Abraham being a foreigner in a distant land and draws an analogy to us. Peter opens up his letter saying he's writing to all the exiles in these provinces. And he means exiles as in Christians living in foreign places. And he references it several times, but here in 1 Peter is perhaps the clearest. Let me find it real quick. It says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Behave in such a way that nobody has anything bad to say about you. Behave in such a way that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and praise your God, that they may or may not even believe it. Put the praise of God on the lips of those who don't believe. Because you are faithful in a land in which you are a foreigner. You may be a fish out of water, but it's only for a time. And one day you're going to go to your home in heaven. And you're going to be right where you belong. And you're going to feel at home. And you're going to understand. And you're going to believe. And you're going to cry if such a thing even exists in heaven. Because it'll be so beautiful. And you'll be home. Right now, we're foreigners. We're fish out of water. We're doing our best to be faithful to God in a world far away from where we belong. Sometimes I joke that sometimes I feel like a fish out of water here in Kansas. I was mostly joking. I feel pretty at home with you guys. You're very kind to me. But there are a lot of people who really find places where they don't belong. And they don't know the language, they don't know the culture. And some of them do fabulous things. And I'm thankful for people who have that kind of courage. I don't know if I do. But those people leave an impact. Because they don't fit in. And they have different values. And they open people's eyes to other things. When we do that, when we live as foreigners, we can put the praise of God on the lips of foreign kings. Father God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you, Lord, that you have blessed us. And I thank you for the book of Daniel and all the really exciting stories in there. And I regret that I couldn't have spent more time on some of them. But Lord, I hope that we can draw this big idea of being faithful to you in a foreign land, of showing the world that you're the one true God, of the fact that when all the other gods disappear, your name is still there. So as we go out in this world and figure out how to be faithful to you, even though we're not home, I pray that we make your name famous. I pray that others will hear of you and praise you and be glad for you because we have been faithful, and we have loved, and we have served, and we have forgiven, and we have made a difference. And Lord, on the day we finally get home, then we can rest. But right now, we're to serve you and make your name famous. So Lord, use us in that way. Write stories as great as those in Daniel. And use us, Lord, to bring your name fame throughout this world. God, we give you glory and honor. And we praise you, the King of all time. Lord, bring us home one day. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.